Now, I want to put a bow on this picture that we've been painting throughout the course today. And your textbook this week is essentially summarizing the lambda CDM, the Big Bang cosmology. It's more or less repeating itself at this point, so I'm not going to waste a ton of time going through that for you. I will just review the basic features of it. And I was talking with some folks before class about just how exciting of a moment this is, because I don't think that any of you will see any radical changes in science like you're going to see in cosmology and astrophysics in the coming decades. It's one of those moments, sort of like the printing press, where things are changing extremely rapidly. This happened a few times in the history of astrophysics, particularly when we realized that the Earth was not a disk, and then when we realized that the Earth was not at the center of the solar system. This was extraordinarily painful. And now we're realizing some very interesting things about the universe itself. And I think that's, in some sense, nowhere more exemplified than this textbook picture from your book, which essentially shows us that our physical model has been shrinking for our universe over the past 50 years. Because if we try to explain things based on what we can see, our picture becomes increasingly untenable over the years, to the point that almost the entirety of our explanation for the way that bodies appear and move and behave in the universe at this point is dependent upon dark stuff that is beyond physics. It's beyond observation and beyond physics. And hopefully last time I made it clear to you that the standard cosmology is not only built on the idea that there must be something which is beyond physics to explain the appearance of everything, but it's also dependent on two very wobbly foundations. One being that the redshift that we see at extraordinary distances are accurate reflections of distance and trajectory, despite the fact that there are some serious problems with that. There's, of course, quasars, which have intrinsic redshifts to them, and they're quite nearby, amongst other things. And then the CMB, which is increasingly problematic, and I think more problematic than ever this year, with the discovery that the location of that CMB doesn't seem to be the same as the location of this redshift singularity if we trace it back. There's some anisotropy that is not consistent. And so these two pillars, along with the conclusion that everything behaves according to non-physical processes, should and are giving people some serious pause for concern. And really our question is boiling down to what comes next. And then, in a very real sense, our question becomes, how did it get this way, and what can we do to protect ourselves from it? And so today we're going to talk about cosmology as a concept and what cosmology has meant over the ages. And I want to go through as many ancient cultures as I possibly can in as short of a time as possible, which is somewhat impossible, but I'll do my best. Because one thing that's happened in the last 100 years or so is that, something that happened obviously about maybe 100 years ago, is that rational thinking, the idea that science is king, became an overwhelmingly popular concept. And this led most of the world to start to turn their back on the traditional religious superstructures that had governed their lives for pretty much ever, right? In most of the states that we're going to talk about, the civilizations, there was no separation between religion and the state. There was no separation between religion and law. And so people's ways of living were very much informed by their authority structures. Now, when all of that disappeared, it left a terrible void, and I think some of the huge conflagrations of the 20th century were a result of that, because people started to believe in the idea that their political structures could provide them with a way of living. And this is how you saw all of the utopian movements of the 20th century come to a head, right? Of course, they were disasters of unimaginable proportions, right? The right-wing utopian ideal was exemplified by the fascists in the early part of the 20th century. It was an ideology based on purity. Perhaps nobody embodied that more than Hitler. He was obsessed with purity, the idea that this is a very ancient, almost pagan idea that there's something pure about a people which could be distilled, and if you just got rid of everything else, everything would be fine. And of course, that led to a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. But on the other hand, there was other utopians too, who imagined that the fundamental power structures were so corrupt that they couldn't be trusted. And so the only way around that was to insist on absolute equality at all costs. And honestly, by very objective measures, that led to even greater crisis. And, of course, the Nazis murdered maybe 6 million dissidents and undesirable people during World War II, but the Soviet communists murdered 60 million people, okay? So neither one of these solutions to putting your idea of how the cosmos should be organized, how your civilization should be organized in the hands of the government by surrendering that belief structure to your political systems didn't seem to work out very well. And, I think that we put those two extreme ideologies to bed to some extent. Nobody's particularly excited about communism or fascism today. But in some sense, we have a real void in the aftermath of that. And we refer to it as perhaps a crisis of meaning. There's a great epidemic of depression and suicide in the world right now, particularly in the West. We don't have that same pillar. And to some extent, I think what's happened here, and we'll go through it so you can see what I mean, is that we've surrendered our belief structures in some sense to science. And the question really becomes, is science the appropriate custodian of our belief structures? Is it really cut out to the job? And so it's very unique that cosmology is in the hands of science right now, because it never has been in the past. And in light of this picture that I've painted for you, I know that I've kind of painted a picture for how this conclusion that we end up with in the scientific textbooks at the moment is a little bit broken. And I want to try to understand why that is. So I hope that I can answer that for you by the end of the day. Maybe not, but at least we can look at the past and get some idea of what's going on. So, it's also really, if I haven't impressed it upon you enough, I think it's important to understand why these questions even matter. Why am I wasting your time to talk about what happened and what's happening? And why does it matter that our cosmology is broken right now? You might think, well, it's just some esoteric thing. Who cares about the universe at large? And I think it matters because it reflects who we are as a people. And we talked last time, I asked you guys to name me one Hollywood movie that has a beautiful vision of the future. And you can't do it, right? Because that's our cosmology today, is one of collapse and one of failure. And it hasn't always been that way. And let me try to convince you of that. So for millennia, for thousands and thousands of years, what we call the solar system today was regarded as the entire universe. And that distinction wasn't actually made until the mid-17th century. And of course, the distinction of our galaxy from the rest of the universe wasn't made until about, well, less than 100 years ago, about 90 years ago. And we've gone over that to some extent. Now, cosmology, cosmos is, of course, the Greek word for order, and ology is the study of it. But cosmology was indistinct from cosmogony for most of history. And cosmogony, gonia means creation in Greek, actually. And so the creation story was inherent in all of these cosmologies that we're going to talk about. And it persists, obviously. We have a creation story in our cosmology today. It's the Big Bang idea, which isn't a particularly unique idea. You'll see that the creation stories that we'll talk about, they all sort of have some common thread to them. There's usually the action or will of some sort of supreme entity. There's this process of metamorphosis where things change from some chaotic form into some ordered form. There's usually some aspect of opposing forces, usually some copulation between male and female deities, which arises out of this chaos. And perhaps there's usually some thread in many cultures of a cosmic egg, which is very similar to the Lamatrian Big Bang idea that there's a nucleus which then gives birth to everything else. So these are very, very old ideas. And in this ideological sense, they try to give people a sense of where everything came from, because ultimately that can be a very puzzling and troubling thing to contemplate. Why are we here and where are we going? Now, the goal of all of the ancient cosmologies was not necessarily to make a physical explanation for what's happening in the scientific sense. But I do think that they stumble on some physical explanations along the way, whether they realize it or not. And a good example of that is the world disk, which is fundamental to certainly Western cosmologies in antiquity, but we see it around the globe as well. And I'm gonna speak about Eastern cosmologies and about Mesoamerican cosmologies to the best of my ability, but because of the language barrier and the record barrier, most of our information comes from the Western tradition, which is rooted in Mesopotamia. And so I think that's a good place to sort of begin our tour of cosmologies. So maybe 3,000 years ago, we find records of this basic idea of the world coming from Mesopotamia, and it's continued into the Hebrew tradition too, which is even better documented. And the basic idea is that there's this flat circular Earth which is enclosed in this cosmic ocean, which is what you see up here. And there are maps found from Babylon to this extent that show the Earth surrounded by this ocean, and there's these 7 islands that are arranged, and they form this 7-pointed star. But the biblical representation has a lot more detail, and so we'll talk about that. Now, the sea from which things arise is an interesting metaphor here, because in some sense, life really does come from the sea and from the water, right? And you can't live without water. But it's also a very scary place to find yourself, right? You can't, it's a very chaotic place. And so the sea tends to represent this early chaos that's present. And what's really interesting about these cosmologies is while they address the formation of the world mythologically, they sort of talk about what's happening inside of you all the time too, at all times. And that's what I think, that's where the real value comes in, and that's what really grants them the authority that they had for thousands and thousands of years, because, of course, the central crisis as a human being is you think you got everything figured out, and then all of a sudden something terrible happens and kicks your legs out from under you. And this happens every day a little bit, some days much worse than others, and you have to find your way back out of that madness. So those are the stories that are playing out in all of these cultures, and they really have painted a map And we talked about how science is essentially a map-making enterprise as well. A theory is essentially a map of how you expect things to behave if you understand some starting conditions. Well, the ancient peoples were also making maps, but they're making maps about what's happening inside of you, right? And that's something that we've not got as a civilization right now. And I don't know that that's a good idea, and we'll talk about some solutions to that as we go ahead. But let's look at this Mesopotamian myth. It's quite interesting. So in the Mesopotamian myth, there's this sea of salt and fresh water, which are represented by these two deities, Apsu and Tiamat. And they're sort of swirling around, and they're actually sort of locked in this almost sexual embrace at the beginning of time. Well, naturally, as sex is wanting to do, they make some babies, and these babies are gods. And we've talked a lot about, in this course, what these pagan gods are exactly, and it's not something we can ignore totally, because we still name all of our planets and many of our probes after these pagan gods, right? Mars and Venus. And we have to think, why do we do this? Is it just some romantic idealization of the past, or is it because it's deeply meaningful to us still? And I think it is deeply meaningful, because I think what these ancient people were representing with their gods was little pieces of ourselves, right? And I've said this before, but it bears repeating. If you've ever been possessed by something, by some feeling, and probably you have, you're all of all different ages, but many of you are probably having some of your first romantic relationships. But even going back before that, maybe in your daily lives you've been upset before, right? And oftentimes when you get upset with somebody, it's happening before you even realize it, right? You seem to be possessed by this action pattern that you don't even realize is happening. Maybe you'll do something that you would never do if you thought about it first. Maybe you punch the wall. Maybe you say something you didn't wish that you had said later on, right? And I think these spirits, these routines, these behavioral patterns, we can make them as neurocognitively platformed as we wish, but ultimately these feelings, these emotions, these subsystems act within everyone. And I think this is what the ancients were trying to represent with their different gods. So at any rate, these two super deities, Apsu and Tiamat, give rise to these gods. Now, the gods actually end up killing the male figure, right? Which is interesting, because the male figure in the Sumerian tradition represents this almost pathological order, right? And this, to some extent, makes you think of a tyrannical government, right? If you have too much order, maybe you've known someone in your life who's just has too much order, right? And there's all sorts of different pathologies: obsessive compulsive, anorexia, people trying to control things to the absolute pathological end of the spectrum. And it happens in governments too, right? When a government becomes so concerned with controlling the behavior of every single decision that you make in life, it becomes untenable, and usually it falls apart. So I think they represent this by the gods rebelling, the emotions, right? These stabilizing forces that are sort of baked into you before you even think. They rebel against that sense of tyrannical order. Anyways, they kill Apsu. Now, Tiamat, Apsu's consort, is of course not happy about this. And so after the gods actually end up killing Apsu, they just feast on his body for a while. And this is interesting too, because in some sense you can think about this representing what happens as a civilization goes into a decay form, right? So the first step that happens in any civilization, and by the way, every civilization we're going to talk to today has collapsed and gone the way of the dinosaurs, which is worth pointing out. Because we're sitting here in our civilization and we're trying to imagine, I hope that we're trying to imagine how it doesn't go that way. But they recognize that it does go that way because perhaps they'd seen that happen many times before history even started, right? I'm sure people were organizing into something approximating political unions for tens of thousands of years before we had cities or anything like that. So they're telling this story and this myth. Anyways, the humans, which had been birthed by the pair of deities, are sitting there, and they're living off of the corpse of Apsu, right? This is, I think this is in some sense what's happening right now in our cosmological science too. We have inherited this series of heroes from the past, Einstein and all of these folks we've talked about and their ideas, and we're building upon these things which are fundamentally contradicting what we're seeing in the world, but we can't stop, right? We don't have anything else to go on, so we keep devouring those ideas. And, well, Tiamat's not happy about this. And she kills all the people. She sends something like a natural disaster. So the flood myth really comes into play here. This is kind of the first time we see it. It makes its appearance in almost every single cultural narrative. Of course, it's most well documented for us in the West in the biblical flood. But there's something interesting to that. It's not so simple as Tiamat represents this unconscious force of nature, right? Because let's think about natural disasters for a second. They're, of course, devastating, but they're much more devastating if your civilization doesn't have its structure put together. Let's think about something like an earthquake, right? There's an earthquake that's maybe huge, about 7.0. It strikes a place like Northridge, California. Well, at the time, Northridge, California was a pretty well put together pocket of civilization. They were able to muster resources to provide aid to the people who were hurt and really get the city back up and running within a matter of days. Now, the result of that was that only 57 people lost their lives in that earthquake, which was absolutely devastating. Meanwhile, you have the same magnitude of earthquake that happens in Haiti, and 200,000 people lose their lives. Now, here you have a situation where Mother Nature comes to call, but one civilization has itself put together in a way that the other civilization doesn't, and it's bad news for the one that doesn't. So I think that there's some wisdom here. It's not just a matter of this sort of blind destruction that occurs. And the result of this was that the gods decided to intervene, right? They decided, okay, Tiamat, we're not going to let you just murder off all of these people. We're going to send someone as a guide to you, someone as a role model, who's going to basically teach you how to react in the face of these disasters that happen. And the name of that deity was called Marduk. Marduk's a really interesting character. He's got a couple of features that are quite interesting. So Marduk has eyes all over his head, which is quite interesting. So he can see really well what's happening. He's very, very interested in paying attention. He's not missing anything that's happening. And one of the terrible things that happens in the decline of civilizations is something like willful ignorance to some extent, right? This is the classic case, like in let's say in the collapse of the French the French royalty, right, during the French Revolution, where you have the royalty who have holed themselves up in these very lavish palaces with no conception of what's happening outside. There's a perhaps apocryphal quote from Marie Antoinette, like, well, you know, Queen, the people are starving, and she says, they say they don't have any bread to eat. And she says, okay, well, just let them eat cake, right? And this seems a little silly, but the idea is that you can turn your head away from things. You can avert your attention. And this is often what leads to complete collapse. And so the interesting thing that the Sumerians did was that they they swore their rulers upon following the role model of Marduk. In other words, and you see this in Egypt as well, the rulers become living embodiments of the deity. They're beholden to behave as if they are this deity as fact. And so that's a pretty cool system if you think about it in a way, because they, if they fail to behave like Marduk, it's kind of the end of them, right? And somebody else gets put in place who can do the job. But the idea that you would have someone who's beholden to this idea that you got to be paying attention and you got to speak that voice. This is another thing about Marduk. He's exemplified by his ability to form words and speak. And this happens, of course, in the biblical narrative as well, and in many, many other cultures. One of the first things that appears in the supreme deity is the ability to speak. And that's really interesting because in some sense, speech is the only thing that holds us back from just murdering the heck out of each other, because we can talk about it. We can come to negotiate circumstances. And so the idea that their supreme deity would be one who can see in all directions and one who can speak what he finds as a result of that, and having that be the role model for their rulers was, man, that's a pretty genius idea, actually, if you think about it. And so they have this mythological structure that reflects their belief of how the world should run, and they force their rulers to embody that to some extent. Now, something kind of beautiful actually happened in our country, which I think has set our country apart from much of history so far, where if we have anything approximating a supreme deity, it might be our founding fathers in this country. But if you think about our founding fathers, one of the most incredible things that our founding fathers did was decide not to be kings, actually. There's a quote from George Washington where he says something like, "The best thing I ever did as president was stop being president," which is something really interesting to think about. And so these sort of overarching mythical narratives are something that we've gotten away from recently, and I want you to think about that as we go forward. Now, of course, the same story plays out in the biblical narrative as well, where there's these the seas, everything right, there's this seas become calm. The primordial forces of disorder are counteracted by the forces of creation. And this plays out in the Jewish narratives, the Hebrew narratives as well. But it also plays out in Egypt, too, which is quite interesting. Now, Egypt's really, really interesting to look at because Egypt, in terms of a role model for a civilization, it's actually hard to beat. If you think about how long Egypt persisted, well, there's actually a lot more time between the beginning of the Egyptian civilization and the end of the Egyptian civilization than there is from the end of the civilization to where we're at right now. So it lasted a really, really long time, and it was fundamentally built on a very similar idea to the Sumerians, with a somewhat commensurate creation myth that had different characters but was ultimately pointing at the same idea. So in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is where we get most of our information from, the world appeared initially as an infinite expanse of dark and directionless waters. They called it Noon. And Noon was actually personified as 4 different pairs of deities, male and female deities. And each couple represented one of 4 different, let's say, personalities of Noon, aspects, which are quite interesting. And then there was this more real deity that was sent to Earth called Re, who was a form, sort of a voice box for the overarching deities that founded the cosmos. And this is very similar to Marduk, actually. Now, what's really interesting is that the humans were created from the eye of Ra. Okay? Again, the eye, the vision is absolutely essential to these people, right? And actually, it's almost impossible to imagine humanity without vision. But this is the way that this is the language we use to describe insight. Even the word insight, look at it, it has the word sight inside of it. You can't actually make any statements about brilliant. What is brilliant? It's bright, you know? That was a brilliant idea. It was blindingly bright, right? There's almost no metaphors for intelligence that don't involve vision, right? This is absolutely essential to everybody, to all of these myths as we see them. The sun was, of course, a symbol of enlightenment. Even the word enlightenment, right? And we see this comes back. This comes back later. The idea that that there's a separation, in some sense, of the cosmos from humanity is playing out in all of these. It plays out in Islam as well. The Quran has this verse. Have those who disbelieve not considered that the heavens and earth were a joined entity at one point, and we separated them? Now, heaven and earth, too, in terms of even the picture of the disk that I showed you before, they mean a very different thing than what people have come to understand them today. Earth, in most of these mythologies, doesn't mean a planet, and heaven doesn't mean some paradise. This is actually a very, very recent conception. Earth to them was very much the world of what's happening here. And heaven was something like the ideal of what that should look like. And so the idea that heaven would come to earth, which is constant, of course, across all of these different mythologies, had a more ordering function, right? And honestly, the idea that what would bind the people together wouldn't necessarily be political structures, but a belief structure is very powerful in and of itself, too. So this world egg idea is something that we see all over the place in other cultures, particularly in indigenous cultures. All of the Proto-European indigenous cultures embraced this world egg idea. And the world eggs, it's a kind of a beginning. The universe is some sort of primordial being that comes into existence by hatching from this egg, which is laid out on the primordial waters of the earth. This is in the Finnish myths. You actually find this in the West African myths. It's in the Japanese myths. And of course, it's in our modern cosmology in the form of Lemaitre's Big Bang. And of course, Lemaitre was a priest. So it shouldn't be too surprising. Now, we'll get back to Einstein in a minute. So the egg symbolizes the unification of two complementary principles, usually. And this is represented by the egg white and the egg yolk, from which life and existence in the world is fundamentally emerging in this philosophical sense. This is everywhere. It's in Taiwan. It's in the Taoist myths and Pangu. It's in Zoroastrianism, which is the root of, which was originally an ancient Iranian sect, but the same story plays out. There's the creation of material from this egg-like event where the sky is first created and closes the world, and that forms another shell, which is egg-like. And then the second creation event is this water that flows from this, which fills the lower half of the egg. And of course, the sky very much looks like a dome, and that's a completely reasonable interpretation. And this plays out in Mesoamerica, too. The Mesoamerican traditions, most of our records come from the Mayans or from the Aztec, and the Aztecs sort of adopted the Mayan ideas to some extent. Now, The Mayans had these two gods also, very much like the Sumerians. Actually, the parallels between the Sumerian myths and the Mayan myths is really uncanny. It kind of gives you the chills the more you study it, because you realize these people had nothing to do with one another, and yet they came up with the same ideas. And how did that happen? There's a different aspect, though, actually, there's a different aspect to this story in Mesoamerica, which is quite interesting. So the Mayans and the Aztecs grew up, the Mayans, to some extent, the Mayans were not just one people, there were many people. But they grew up in the shadow of this, there's right outside of Mexico City, there's a great ancient city called Teotihuacan. I've been there twice, it's quite incredible. Some of the biggest pyramids by footprint in the world, actually. They're not as tall as the Great Pyramids in Giza. But by the time that the great Mayan civilizations and the Aztec civilizations were being founded, this Teotihuacani civilization was completely abandoned, and there was no idea of who these people were, only that they were a great people and that their civilization had failed somehow. This is really interesting because, and I think this speaks to our crisis of meaning here in the United States, or in the West, let's say, since the United States is in some very real sense at the forefront of the West. You have to imagine that it must have been like if we had come to America and we had set about to build something like San Francisco or Los Angeles, and there had been an abandoned Los Angeles right next door to it, how much would that have changed the way that we thought about time and we thought about civilization? Because the product of this was that the cosmology of the Mayans and of the Mesoamerican civilizations was one of cyclicity. It was one where time, as they thought about it, but you might say a civilization's lifespan, was finite. A civilization would grow and disappear, and then the whole thing starts over, and this is just the way things go. And in some sense, we don't have that recognition here in the West, because there was nothing that was in ruins when we got here. We've never seen our present system of democracy fail before. And so we have this very linear sense of time, which is this idea of progress, that things keep getting better and better and better forever. At least we hope they do. And I would love to believe that that's the case. But it's very much not how the Mesoamericans saw things. And so they had this idea that there's these, about 5,000-year-long eras that repeat themselves. And of course, the most recent one ended in 2012, and there's all sorts of apocalyptic predictions. But if you talk to the Mayans at the time that this was all going down, the remaining Mayans, there's actually quite a few Mayan villages in Guatemala, and there's a number of people who still inherit the language and the practices of these ancient civilizations to some extent. They would have told you, no, it's not the end of the world, it's just the end of this world. There will be another world afterwards, right? And this cyclic cosmology was actually also present in India. So the Indians believed of these very, very long epochs where there was this continual creation and destruction of the universe that occurred over and over and over again. Indigenous cosmologies are a little bit different, too, across the board. And it's a very difficult matter to study indigenous cosmologies because you have to really talk to people. Their traditions are orally transmitted. They don't have libraries the same way that we do in the West. Now, indigenous cosmologies, I think we have a lot to learn from them because, from what I can gather, they're very much concerned with the close relationship between human beings and animals. And this is really quite interesting a lot of these Native American traditions, their apocalyptic vision is one of that they believe is already unfolding before them right this moment. They actually think the end of the world has come because their myths generally speak of star people coming and ruling unsuccessfully over the land. And they very much believed that when the colonialists arrived, that that's what was happening. And I think this is a very, very real aspect of reality too. And what's quite interesting is I had this really fascinating podcast a couple days ago with this professor at University of North Carolina, and she's studying the UFO phenomena on Earth right now. And well, there's a lot to say about that. But one thing that she's been doing is talking to indigenous people, because of course UFOs have been reported for thousands and thousands of years. People have been seeing weird stuff in the sky. And the way that the Westerners look at UFOs is that, oh, well, there's some organism, some entity, human-like entity, whatever, from some distant system that's going to come here and colonize us on Earth. But the way the indigenous people look at UFOs is that they're already here. They're already the force, the technological force that is oppressing their way of life, right? And so it's very interesting. She was speaking with some different tribes about their conception of the technological revolution with AI that's happening right now, which is, of course, very troubling in some sense. You know, there's a lot of panic about this. ChatGPT 4 just came out. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to play with these at all. A little bit, yeah. They're pretty amazing. GPT-4, I mean, if you talk to people, I have a number of tech people in my family, and it's almost like the second coming with this stuff, right? This is like a real deity to these people. And the native people that Dr. Pazuko was interviewing, they were like, yeah, the aliens are not going to come from another star system. They're going to come from within these technological platforms, which is quite interesting. So I think that there's a lot of wisdom there. And of course, I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but climate change aside, there's some very serious concerns about the wilderness right now. I go out in the woods all the time, and there's no animals. It's very strange. And actually, the fish have been they've been next to eradicated from the oceans. There's something like 25% of the fish there were back in the 1970s in the ocean, right? There's some very, very troubling apocalyptic features going on. And so the question is whether technology is up to the task of repairing that situation, or, as the indigenous people might believe, that the triumph over technology is actually what will save the world, which is an interesting feature to imagine. Okay, so at some point, and actually we can put a date on that, in the Western tradition, this idea that cosmology could be rationalized was put forth. This was the idea that the way things are was not due to some inherent mystical order of the universe, but in fact due to the interactions between physical objects. And this was quite revolutionary. It didn't actually happen until fairly recently in the scale of the events that we're talking about. Let's say about the 6th to 4th century BCE, these Greek philosophers like Anaximander introduced this idea that there might be different worlds, multiple worlds. Maybe each one of the stars in the sky was its own world. Democritus, these Greek words are hard. Democritus gave us the idea of the atom, actually in a poem, which is quite fascinating. And also elaborated on this idea that all of these distant worlds were varied in their size and in their distance. They had different numbers of suns and moons, and they were subject to all sorts of chaos that might shape their presence. And perhaps our own Earth had a past like this. Very shortly thereafter, the the Greeks established the idea that the Earth is actually a sphere and not flat, right? And so this was kind of a boom and a real revolution in people's way of thinking, which is in some sense quite beautiful, but 2,000 years later it seems to have obliterated the actual idea that there's anything in the way of narrative that backs up what we see happening, which is a bit of the tragedy. So as we move forward, Aristotle follows in Plato's Earth-centered universe, right? The Earth is stationary, and the cosmos, the universe, is revolving around us. He actually argues for the spherical Earth as well, supports that using lunar eclipses. Later on, Aristarchus of Samos, we talked about this last semester, does a great job of defending a sun-centered universe for the first time, which gets lost in the Middle Ages. He provides evidence for the size of the Earth, the distance to the sun. These are all very simple calculations you can do in your own backyard, by the way. I don't have time to go through that with you right now. And this cascade of rationalism, it just compounds and compounds and compounds. The motion of the planets are deduced. They actually erect this series of, one really interesting seed that's planted here too, is that mathematics becomes king for the first time. And it actually, much in the way that I think that we've become obsessed with mathematics in our own study of the physical universe today, it kind of took them off the rails for a little while as well back in the Greek period, because what happened was the greatest mathematician of the day, Pythagoras, had convinced everyone that the circle was the most perfect geometric object imaginable. And as a result of that, the motions of the planets had to in some way be circular. And so the Greeks and their descendants into Roman times developed this Ptolemaic system for the motion of the bodies, which was based on this absolutely complicated and elaborate system of circles that provided for the strange motion of the planets in the sky. Because, of course, if you look at the sky at night, it's pretty simple at first. The stars rotate around your head. Okay, very simple to explain. But some of the stars don't do that, right? We now know these as planets, but they actually, if you watch them over the course of many nights, they start to go backwards at some points. Now we realize this is, of course, because we're overtaking them in our orbit. But they didn't understand this at the time, and the way that they explained it was saying that these planets were on their own little orbits, they were on other orbits, and they were orbiting around, around the Earth and around the sun, depending on which camp you were on at the time. And so this obsession with the perfection of mathematics actually led them off the rails, and I think that there's an admonition there about the present. The many worlds thing is quite interesting because this got people in a lot of trouble. Of course, we talked about Giordano Bruno, who got burned at the stake for suggesting that other worlds were out there. But the Buddhists also speak of, at least as early as the 5th century, they speak of hundreds of thousands of billions of countlessly, innumerable, boundlessly, incomparably, incalculably, unspeakably, inconceivably, immeasurably, inexplicably many worlds to the east, and infinite worlds in the 10 directions. The Islamic scholars rejected this Aristotle's Earth-centered universe, and there's a Quranic verse that says, "All praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds," plural, and more or less proposes that the universe has 1,000 worlds beyond this world, right? So the idea that the cosmos was bigger than just what was happening here started to become a modern obsession. Nicholas of Cusa brought that home in the 15th century, and Bruno, of course, got in a lot of trouble. Nicholas Cusa was more in with the church, and so his ideas were published. Then, of course, we had the printing press, which was quite fascinating, because it much like the internet, changed the way everything was done. Actually, the Copernican revolution, the idea that finally, once and for all, that a scientist had convinced the church that indeed we were not at the center of the universe, but we in fact orbited the sun, was only made possible because Copernicus was able to self-publish that idea. And he was able to eventually, he did it at the end of his life, as most people who change paradigms have to do. He self-published that, but he carried his manuscript around in his pocket for his entire life, and he discussed it with people he was close to, and he refined his ideas, and he refined his calculations. And eventually he was able to publish it. It was widely distributed by his supporters after his death, and it became the foundation for our rational astrophysical paradigm and our rational planetary sciences. Now, Galileo tried to champion that idea, right? He, of course, got in a lot of trouble, ended up getting locked away in his house for the rest of his life. I don't think that was because, I think that was more because of the way he went about it. And perhaps I've mentioned it already in this course, but it's painted rather poorly in the textbook of why Galileo. It's often painted, well, Galileo opposed the church's idea of the Earth being at the center of the universe, and so they locked him up. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. Galileo actually, he conveyed his idea in the form of a dialogue. He wrote a dialogue. It was a novel, essentially. And in his dialogue, one of the characters was a character named Simplicus, who was kind of a moron. And this character was essentially a perfect likeness to the Pope at the time. Okay, so he was making fun of the Pope, and the Pope didn't like that. So that probably had a lot more to do with why Galileo got in trouble. But Galileo did do a great deal of work. He had the first telescope. He was able to actually look out and see that there was individual stars and a lot of these nebula that we thought were just hazy clouds in the sky. And this really started to reinforce the idea that there was different worlds and that our world was just one of many. Now, Kepler, of course, came and developed those ideas into the universal laws of motion, which we essentially base all of our estimates of mass at this point on. Of course, Newton gave us the idea of mass using Kepler's laws. And we use these to do everything now. All of our direct measures, all of our estimates of the mass of bodies have to do with the way they rotate around one another, which is a little bit of a disaster too, because we've talked about the galactic rotation problem and actually how much the galaxies don't seem to rotate because of their mass. And this leads us to dark matter and all of that. John Locke, actually, the philosopher, gave us the term solar system, which is interesting. Kant, another philosopher, gave us the basic picture we have for how solar systems are formed. This was back in the 1700s, very early 1700s. And then we've basically covered the rest of the history of rational astrophysics and so forth since then. I've gone into the details of the 1800s, so I'm not going to bore you with that. Now, almost everyone, all the way up until about 1930, and really all the way, and really there was considerable debate until about 1990, had embraced the idea of an eternal universe, right? Now, Einstein believed that the form of that eternal universe was static. But when he developed his theory of relativity, he found that wasn't a totally tenable proposition, because masses distributed throughout the universe would gravitationally attract and they should clump together over time, but that's not what we see happening. So he introduced this cosmological constant into his model, which he was very uncomfortable with, and this was some sort of repulsive force that kept things from clumping together. Only when this redshift distance relationship was announced by Hubble was Einstein relieved to come to the conclusion that, well, the motion of the bodies apart from one another due to what? To the expansion of space-time would rescue the need for this cosmological constant. And what strikes me as a bit strange is that nobody really probed into this concept enough to realize that space-time is just an idea. It's a series of locations in time, and that saying that the locations in time are moving apart doesn't really get you any closer to an explanation for why they're moving apart in time, if indeed that's what they're doing. At any rate, Einstein surrendered his static model to the Lemaitrian bang model eventually. Now, all the way through the 1940s and 1960s, the astrophysical community was pretty much equally divided between supporters of the Big Bang theory and supporters of the steady state theory. And it wasn't really up until the discovery of the CMB that the majority, the consensus opinion, swayed away from the steady state model. Now, there was one detractor who was a very, very prominent astrophysicist named Fred Hoyle, and he had a couple of other associates that worked with him who tried to rescue the flaws of the steady state model. And he tried to explain the expansion observations in a steady state way, which I think is quite interesting. He ended up essentially dying and people moved on. But his idea was something like this, that yes, he said, okay, fine. It seems like with this redshift analysis that the bodies are moving apart from one another, but the reason they're doing that is not because there was a bang a long time ago, but it's because matter is continually being created, particularly from the active galactic nuclei that we talked about, which are, it's worth saying that that is some of the least understood business in all of astrophysics and all of astrophysics. And so the idea was that as the galaxies created new matter, they pushed apart from one another. And so galaxies were continually being formed and destroyed. And as they were doing that, there was this apparent expansion because, well, they're pushing things away from them as they do this. Hoyle had a hard time with the CMB, though, right? And the CMB, I think we've beat on it enough, but the CMB was, it was hailed as the greatest triumph of cosmology, and it was really the first time that cosmology was treated as a physical science, because it's hard to explain exactly how empirically robust the detection of this signal was. The error bars on this signal were absolutely phenomenal, right? And these measurements were made on Earth initially, they were made in weather balloons next, and finally, much later, we put satellites up in space after the space revolution, right around the Earth, and we made these measurements, and we got these beautiful black body spectrums, and I'll come back to those in a minute. There's actually on the table right now a completely different representation, which is It gets a fair amount of play in astrophysical communities. It's called MOND, and the idea is that if you modify Newtonian gravity and you modify the way that gravity plays out at large scales, that you can explain the appearance of, say, the galactic rotation problem. You can get rid of dark matter by tweaking Newton's equations. Now, I'm not particularly excited about this solution because the life raft that they throw you involves another field which is inexplicable. There's a different set of constants which are introduced that have no explanation whatsoever. And so I'm not sure that it's really much of an improvement over the concept of dark matter and dark energy. But there you have it. That's one you'll hear about probably if you look at the literature. So as you can see, we've moved into an era where physics seems to have swallowed cosmology, which initially was a very mythological endeavor. And as a result of the Enlightenment and the rational movements that have carried us through our technological boom and given us all of this amazing technology, we don't really have a home for cosmology outside of physics. And the question is that a good thing? All cosmologies seem to begin with the realization that reality is absolutely too complex to be pondered in whole, right? We have to make maps that simplify things to by degrees. So how do we do that? Well, fundamentally, we tell stories, because the story seems to be the smallest unit of conveying meaningful information from one person to the next. Well, when you have enough stories coming in from enough people, you begin to see patterns in those stories, and you make meta-stories out of it. And this is where we get myth. And of course, the context is extremely important. If you walk into a culture that you have no familiarity with and you hear those myths, the characters might not make any sense to you. But the underlying principles, when you really peel back and start to understand, turn out to be deeply human. And one thing that's also really interesting here, if we think back to Marduk, is that seeing is really important and paying attention is really important. And if we want to answer the question of how did we get to the point where our cosmologies are dependent on 99.9% of stuff that we can't even see, measure, and doesn't seem to behave physically, we have to kind of ask the question of what's gone wrong here. Well, you might think that you're really good at seeing things, but the truth is that you're really good at seeing the things you expect to see, right? Like I'm standing here in front of you right now, and everybody's sort of doing whatever. There's, somebody typing on a laptop here in the front row. There's people wiggling and doing things, but it doesn't really matter to me, right? Because I'm here to speak with you, and that's my primary concern. So your individual motions and stuff are not something I'm deeply paying attention to, and in fact, I don't even notice they're happening at some point. Now, the thing is that we believe that in some sense, because science is an objective pursuit, that we're capable of not seeing what we don't know that we're seeing. In fact, we can fixate on things to the extent that we are able to embrace a bit of that willful ignorance at some point, because our power structures depend upon it. I've talked about this a lot in the course already, but it's almost impossible to go into an institution and think you're going to change that institution, right? If you want to change something fundamentally, you probably have to build a new institution next door to it that does a better job than the original institution. And we talked about just how bad people are at perceiving things when they're paying attention, like the gorilla story or the kids giving tours and swapping out the tour giver in the middle of a blackboard that passes in between them or a door, right? You pay attention to what you think is important to the task that you're undergoing at the time. And so in many senses, that's what's happened inside of the academy up to this point. So we've been very fixated on explaining the little pieces of the story that we take as foundational without revising those original assumptions in the first place. How do we know what we don't see? Well, we end up with these outrageous proposals like dark matter and dark energy, which are placeholders that now fill the entirety of the place for the most part, right? We can't actually explain how the things that we see are doing what they're doing, and so we've invented mysterious, magical, dark substances to do the job for us. So can we answer our question? Why is our physical cosmology so clouded and bizarre and teetering? Well, one thing that's happened that's very curious is we don't seem to have defined what physics is at any point since we've started doing it, which is very strange, actually. And physics, of course, is often heralded as the king of sciences, right? But what is physics exactly? Anybody? Yeah.
Sorry. The rules that govern the world, or the physical, basically the physical boundaries?
But you use the word physical inside of it. You can't do that. Yeah.
The laws that govern motion.
Motion. And what is motion? The laws that govern motion is what he says.
Movement relative.
Can't use movement.
The change of location relative to something else.
And what is a thing?
Beingness in space.
Okay, so I think that you're very, very close, yeah. I think that physics fundamentally is about bodies. It's about bodies, right? Something with a surface that can interact with another surface, right? A body is defined by its structure, its architecture, right? And motion has no definition other than the changing location of one body with respect to another. And so you're right, physics is fundamentally about the dynamics of bodies, how bodies interact with one another. But sadly, this is not taught on the first day of physics, right? This hasn't become a fundamental assumption. In fact, a lot of physical theory today begins with things in motion already that are unspoken. Now, there's a word for this in philosophy. It's called reification. It means to mistake the concreteness of an idea, to treat an idea as if it's concrete, and to move it around, to apply motion to ideas. Now, I can't hand you some compassion or something, right? I can't toss you some anger, right? You can't actually apply physical concepts, to ideas, right? But we do that in modern physics all the time, and it's gotten us into a real ditch. There's also the problem that physics has no wisdom in it, right? Science has no real wisdom in it. It really just addresses the material cause of phenomena, how those bodies bump or pull on one another in order to produce an effect. It can't tell you anything about how to live in the world, what works and what doesn't work. Now, you might be able to say it can make an inventory of what's happened in the past, and perhaps there is some hope that there is some scientific analysis that can help. But I don't think that science is really capable of replacing cosmology in terms of explaining our place in the world and what we should be doing with our lives and how we should comport ourselves with respect to our civilization level goals. Myth, on the other hand, also makes maps, just like science, right? They're a different kind of map. They map the metaphysical territory. They take all of those individual stories of tyranny and oppression and overcoming those forces, and they erect meta-stories of what happens when people misbehave themselves and what the eventuality of that is. Now, we do have some myth in our culture. It's not dead, right? So I think film is really, really important. It's sort of the modern literature, in a sense. We spend, I forget what the statistic is, but people spend a great deal of time watching myths play out in film. When I was a kid, it was music for me. It was lyrical music. This is where I sought out wisdom, particularly in folk music, because these are real people who are going through some real tough times. And they actually, if you listen hard enough, they can actually tell you how to live, right? And in the best case scenario, our myths in film, in art, in dance. Of course, the Native Americans often play out their myths in dance, which is quite interesting. In motion, in physical motion. In sports, in athletics, this happens as well. So what I'm working towards proposing here for you is that those are probably some really good places for cosmology, right? There's a lot of refuge for cosmological ideas that aren't inside of science. Because the fact of the matter is that physical objects crashing into one another and pulling on one another is just a description of what's happening. It doesn't really tell you if it's a good thing or not, and if it's something you should rush towards. So what does our metaphysical cosmology look like in the future? What is our unifying ideology in America? Do we have one? I mean, I would say that if we have anything approximating a unifying value structure in this country, it's something like the belief that you can make yourself what you want to make yourself, which is a really revolutionary idea, actually, if you think about it. You know, in most of these civilizations that we touched on today, you had a place in the world. And you looked to your ruler as the supreme example of how one should be. But you followed that ruler, and you followed them to the death. And if they didn't behave themselves, well, you killed them, and you got a new one who would do it. But in America, we kind of have this beautiful idea that you can be your own ruler. And this is at the heart of democracy, actually. This is what, in its most ideal form, makes democracy far superior to every other kind of organizational principle that's been attempted. And it's that idea that you have sovereignty over your own life, and that if each person took sovereignty over their own life and really, really comported themselves with their own sense of what is ideal, not doing what Dr. DeLay thinks is best for you to do or what your mom thinks is best for you to do, but what you thought was best for you to do. If everyone did that, what would the world look like? But how many people are just doing what they think they should be doing because somebody else told them to do it? And I would say that is completely antithetical to this foundational idea that we have here at the bleeding edge of civilization. Now, of course, that comes with great responsibility, and it's not clear that it's that easy to do for everyone, and that much freedom, of course, can come with freedom overload. And trying to create your own mythological structure for yourself is perhaps an impossible task. And so I really wonder if we'll be able to find our way back to some unifying mythology in the future. But it seems like it's necessary. It seems like we can't get away from it. And I don't think that science is going to be able to do it for us. So at the end of all of this, we have to ask ourselves whether we're happy with this cosmology that we've been handed, this cosmology where the universe expands into infinity and ends in a heat death of everything. Whether we're happy with our explanations terminating in non-physical processes, whether we're happy with explaining the motions of bodies that are dependent upon mysterious magical goo, whether we're happy with our story of how stars evolve, terminating in the breakdown of physics, or whether we should go back and re-examine some of these fundamental pictures, whether we should go back 100, 200 years and think about our fundamental assumptions, whether we should think about how strange it is that black body radiation in every experiment we've ever done can only be produced by a solid or liquid, and yet stars, which we claim are gaseous plasma, have perfect black body spectrums. How is that possible? Or do we misunderstand fundamentally what a star is? Are there other ways in which stars could be fusing and making new elements? Because from a very real technological standpoint, we need clean energy on this planet, right? The whole thing is kind of going to pot, right? The oceans are dead. We're polluting. Cancers are on the rise. There's a lot of bad stuff happening. We need clean energy sources. And a lot of people hope that fusion could do that for us. But if we can't understand how stars work because we're willfully ignorant of what we're missing, then we're probably not going to be able to develop those technologies. Almost 99% of the fusion technologies that are being examined right now are concerned with taking a gaseous plasma and getting it to fuse, which you can do, but it's not a very energy efficient way of doing it. And on the edge of the fusion research, there's people looking at the way that solids can do fusion as well. They call it lattice confined fusion. It's actually a room temperature reaction. It's much more energetically favorable. And so I guess what I want to leave you with is the sense that these big questions do matter, not only in a giant civilization level realization, but on a very real technical fundamental level in terms of moving our world forward into a cleaner and better future. Anyways, it's been really fun doing this class with you guys, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your year. Thank you so much.